I'm sure those of you who are Californians, and I know there's some spies in here from California who probably know this already. In fact, many of you probably do, but the first vineyards that people count as vineyards that were planted in California were in the late 1700s. And that was Father Junipero Serra, who was on a mission to convert all the Indians in California to Christianity, but he needed wine for the Mass, so he planted mission grapes everywhere he went, and the missions were a donkey's day ride apart. So pretty soon he got as far north as Sonoma with the mission. So mission grapes were everywhere. He also was scattering mustard seeds all over the place, and they're still around too.
What varietals were those mission grapes?
It was mission. I don't think anybody really knows what it was. I have never seen any, sort of DNA discussions about its parentage, but it's just called mission. It's a very uninteresting grape, but it worked for sacramental purposes. And it actually was one of the reasons why California wines got off to sort of a bad start as their reputation, because that's what the wines were being made out of when people started making wine commercially. And the wine was just not very good. It was very productive, but it was easy to grow, but the wine was meh. So that and a number of other things really caused California to start off with a reputation for not such great wines. That started to change when people arrived here in Napa. And George Yount, after whom Yountville is named, was the first white man to get to the Napa Valley. He was a trapper, actually, but he planted the first vineyard here in 1838. So that's pretty recent. If you're, thinking about Bordeaux history, 1838 doesn't have a deep history, let's put it that way. And I'm sure he planted mission grapes too. 20 years later, there were only 225 acres of vineyard planted here in Napa. So it had grown, but not a whole lot, right? However, the gold rush was already beginning to have its impact on California, and that brought all kinds of entrepreneurial people out in this direction, most of whom failed in the gold fields, so they went off to do something else to make a living because they liked California and they weren't going to go back to where they came from. And some of them had come from wine-growing families, and some of them hadn't, but they got to Napa and saw that this was one of those blessed Mediterranean climates that will grow anything well. And a few of them planted grapes, and boy, did that work. So it was pretty diversified agriculture. In fact, until the 1950s, cattle was the #1 ag product in Napa, if you can believe that. It was like 99% of the ag value coming out of Napa. But there are reasons for that. So in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, the wine business here just really took off because there were some very smart marketers who planted good grapes, not mission grapes, but good grapes, like Cabernet. It was very early planted here, along with a whole lot of other things that we've mostly forgotten in California, like Chasselas, which is a Swiss variety. That was still around when we got to Napa in the 1970s. Green Hungarian was here, Burger. Things that you really wouldn't want to put in a wine bottle anymore. But they had all been planted around here and had contributed to the very rapid growth of a thriving wine industry. There were, I think, over 200 wineries here by the 1880s. And I think about 25,000 acres of grapes planted in the Napa Valley. The first winery in fact, it still exists today, was Charles Krug, founded by Charles Krug in 1861. Then after them came a whole lot more in Inglenook, which the Daniels family bought many years later. In the early 1900s, George de la Tour showed up and created Beaulieu Vineyard. Actually, this is kind of interesting. Beaulieu Vineyard used to be the Ewer and Atkinson winery, and that was owned by the guy who built St. Super. He didn't build St. Super. He built the house on St. Super's property, that Victorian house. That was Mr. Atkinson, and his partner Seneca Ewer. The two of them together built the winery that still exists. You can see it on a little date thing when you drive by on the highway. You can see the date. I think it says 1881. That would become Beaulieu many years later. So there was a lot of founding of wineries and selling of wineries going on because there were recessions happening. Then the big one happened, and that was Phylloxera in the 1880s and 1890s, which totally wiped out everybody. because, you know, the vineyards were planted on their own feet as they had been in Europe. You know, that was the history, and that's what people knew how to do. So when Phylloxera, which is a Native American bug, found all those nice grapevines in Napa, it said, lunch, I'm here, and just took them all down. And about the same time that was going on in Europe too. So it took about, I think, 15 years for some bright soul to notice that the American grapes, the Native American grapevines, didn't die like the European varieties did, and said, ha, maybe, just maybe, there's an opportunity here, and that's where the whole grafting idea came about. And we've been grafting onto Native American rootstocks and hybrids thereof ever since to keep Phylloxera at bay. So, but that was a big setback for the wine business, and it took just long enough that, you know, then World War I intervenes, and that sort of kept everybody from coming back to life. Then Prohibition happened, which really kept the wine industry from coming back to life. I mean, it went on for so long, you know, it was like 13 or 14 years, that you just can't hope to wait it out if you're a farmer. So people either started making sacramental wines, a few of them did, Beaulieu was one.
That was exempt from Prohibition?
Yeah, there were a couple of exemptions. Yeah, another one was that heads of households could make up to 200 gallons of wine for personal use. So the families, of course, I guess, got to drink them too, not just the heads of household. But, and the other thing that happened was that for the thicker skinned varieties, they would actually ship grapes back east, and they'd be sold as fresh grapes. And then people would make that into wine. It didn't make very good wine because the thicker skinned grapes tend not to make very good wine. And then they made these wine bricks where they would dehydrate grapes, you know, and condense them into these bricks that are labeled, please don't add water to this or something might happen, you know, and of course those were the instructions, please add water, make your own wine. I mean, Prohibition was a really funny time. So anyway, things were pretty dead around here, and a lot of diversified farming cropped up to replace this thriving wine business that had, not only did we have a great climate here to grow wine grapes, but we were also close to the port of San Francisco, which was really handy. It's very hard to be out in the wilderness making great wine and get it to market. And that's one of the reasons why in the early days of the Napa wine industry, the wines didn't get back east, because until the Transcontinental Railroad was built, it was very expensive to ship wine from California back east. So Europe had the East Coast all to itself, basically. And in the Midwest, the Missouri and Ohio were growing lots of wine for the locals, but they were using American grapes, so the wine was really different. I'm being nice here when I say that. Anyway, so just to circle back to that 25,000 acres of grapes that was built here, that was thriving here in the 1880s, I should say. It was 100 years later before we got back to that amount of acreage here, which is just tells you how bad things were, or how difficult, you know, challenging. But in the meantime, we were growing Christmas trees and walnuts and prunes and lots of cattle, and so a few wineries, few vineyards pooping along, but not much. Certainly no new wineries happening during that period. So we get out of Prohibition, and then there's the Depression and Second World War, and then the Korean War, and then you name it. It just went on and on like this. And it wasn't until the 1950s and 60s that a couple of new small wineries popped up. That's Stony Hill, I think, was created in the 50s. But most people sort of think of the relaunch of Napa into the wine business as 1966, when Robert Mondavi built his winery. And that really set off a huge period of growth, the second big period of growth after the one in the 1880s. So we went from less than 3 dozen wineries in 1966 here in Napa to, I think, where nobody really knows how many there are. There are 500 members of the Napa Vintners organization, but they've changed the rules. So you no longer have, the feds have changed the rules. You no longer have to have a bricks and mortar winery to have a winery where you can lock up the inventory so they can claim their excise taxes when you sell the wine. Now you can have a virtual winery. You can use somebody else's winery. I mean, that's what we do. We actually outsource winemaking after making wine in the barn out there for a while and finding that inadequate. We started outsourcing, and that's a very common thing to do here. But that was a new idea in Napa. In fact, custom crushing didn't even start happening until the 1980s around here. It's very common in Burgundy and in the south of France and probably plenty of other places, but it was a very late arrival here. Okay, so now where we are today, phew. So we had a bad reputation for quality, and part of that was the mission grape, and part of that was the practice of planting field blends. You know, a lot of the Italians would do this. In fact, that's where we got our budwood, from an old vineyard over in Sonoma that was planted to Italian varieties, one of which happened to be Sangiovese. But you know, they don't plant them in neat, tidy rows. This is a row of Sangiovese, this is a row of Barbera, this is a row of something else. Oh no, they're all mixed up in there as individual vines. So unless you're really good at reading leaves, or you planted the vineyard yourself and paid a lot of attention to it, or farmed it for years and really knew what was where, they'd just pick it all at the same time. And the early varieties and the late varieties and all that, boom, all went into the same pot, with the theory that they'd all balance one another out into a drinkable wine, and off you'd go. Well, that didn't work real well. It didn't work as well in terms of quality. I mean, it worked in terms of farming. But for quality, and Napa very quickly started focusing on quality, because it became apparent that we could do that here. You know, we had the kind of climate that will let you do that. So these early entrepreneurs, you know, like John Daniel was one, and Georges de la Tour was another, and after Prohibition, Louis Martini really focused on varietal labeling of wines, instead of just red wine or white wine, or stealing a European name, which was quite common. You know, my first job in the wine business was as a tour guide at Beaulieu in 1972, and I didn't know until later I was their first female tour guide. But you know, that's another evolutionary thing. But they were still selling wines then that were called Sauterne. There was an haute Sauterne and a dry Sauterne, I think is what the labels were. And they also had a Burgundy, which was obviously a Pinot Noir, but they didn't call it that. There was something else they had. I can't even remember.
I was in college in the 60s, and
yeah, me too.
thrived on Gallo Hardy Burgundy.
Yeah,
But
I'm talking Napa here, but Gallo certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't think it was Pinot.
no, it could have been anything. I think the Burgundy up at Beaulieu had a lot of, it had some Mondeuse in it, didn't it? And Gamay, that's what it was. It had Gamay. It actually told you on the back label. It was Gamay and Mondeuse and one other thing that I can't remember. Yeah.
Wasn't Napa loaded with Zinfandel, I thought at one point?
Not so much. There was a lot of Zinfandel in California, but not so much here. Yeah, there was some, but not a lot. Yeah. So, let's see. I mean, these wines used to be sold in bulk, you know, by the gallon. Boom, boom. They take them to San Francisco in barrels, not barrels, but big containers, because the barrels didn't show up until much more recently. They take them down there to bottle the way they might do in Bordeaux with a négociant. But then gradually they started adopting the mise en bouteille au chateau sort of idea, even though they didn't call it that, and got very focused on varietal labeling. In fact, it was Frank Schoonmaker, who was an importer in the 1950s, who really promoted the idea of varietal labeling, because he thought it was a really bad thing to be borrowing these European appellation names with, you know, it was just bad form. And there was a better way. So that encouraged people to spend more time thinking about what they were growing and what was working best on their own property, though that took a long time to refine, and what they could sell. And there was a real education issue, because the public, the consumers, you know, didn't know what Cabernet was. Somebody had to tell them what it was. Chardonnay didn't even happen around here until 1970. When we got here in 72, there were about 300 acres of Chardonnay in California. And it had just arrived in Napa, and everybody, the winemakers, were all so excited about it. They thought, oh, this is really great, we're going to make. They talked about making the great wines of the world here. There were 4 of them. Anybody care to guess what the 4 varieties were? Cabernet. Yeah.
Merlot?
No.
No?
Nope.
Pinot Noir and Syrah.
Say again?
Pinot Noir and Syrah.
Pinot Noir was one of them, yeah.
Sangiovese.
Nobody ever gets this one. It's fascinating. Riesling. At that time, those were the 4 noble varieties in Europe, okay? Things have changed, right? Well, people did try Riesling, but there's hardly anybody around here who still makes it. Trefethen's one, and Stony Hill's another that I can think of off the top of my head. Smith Madrone does too. Yeah, that's right. So the modern era erupts in 1966. The rules change probably 20 years after that, opening up the opportunity to not have to make such a huge upfront investment in assets like a winery that you can lock up and a vineyard that you plant yourself and wait for and then make your own wine and all that. I mean, the opportunity for outsourcing everything has really let a lot of new entrants into the business. You know, a lot of virtual wineries around here that are functionally brands. But if they're using Napa wines, you know, there are controls. We do have some rules around here. And appellations mean something. They didn't used to, okay? Because the feds actually, at the end of Prohibition, instituted the varietal labeling laws. And what they said, they wanted to leave the max, I'm sure this was under pressure from people who were making these blends, that you'd have to have a minimum 51% of that varietal named on the label in the bottle. 51%. Now imagine that, okay? How good can that wine be? Will you even recognize it as the named varietal? Probably not. And so blending got a really bad reputation for being an opportunity to take something good and stretch it, you know, by blending it with something inferior, but to bulk it up, basically, you know? Okay, so then in 1978, the feds changed the rules to make a minimum of 75% varietal required. That helped improve the quality because now you could start recognizing these varietals that were named on the label. And it applied also to the appellations, which were at that time pretty minimal. They were counties or states or the whole country. But the AVAs, the American Viticultural Appellations, didn't happen until 1980. And people think that Napa was the first one, but it wasn't. It was Missouri, someplace in Missouri. Yeah, there's so much wrong information out there. It's incredible. I did a little bit of reading on this yesterday, and I'm going, that's not right. But I could be wrong too. So, you know, look it up for yourself. But look it up in several places because they don't all agree.
So originally, if it was labeled as Rutherford or something, did it have to have 75% of the grapes from Rutherford? Was it?
No. Once the AVAs happened, then if you had an AVA, that was a minimum 85%. But that didn't happen until a little bit, really, after the increase to the 75%.
So are the rules still 75% for varietals and 85% for the AVAs?
Yes, that's correct. Right. And then vintage used to be 100%, but it's been 95 for quite a while because the industry rose up and said, look, we need to be able to top our barrels. You know, give us a little leeway here. That's how the 95% thing happened. People get very confused about this because it's 75 if it's a county and it's 85 if it's an AVA. And but the 75 applies to varietals. Meanwhile, there was some work to be done to rehabilitate the idea of blending, which, as you all know, the Commanderie de Bordeaux, that is, you know, that's sort of what you do, right? It's what you've always done, and it's perfectly good. In fact, there are lots of good reasons to do it. Same thing in Champagne. Here, not so much, because people thought they just had the wrong idea about blending. So that was there was a lot of talk about requiring 100% varietals, which nobody bought into because on a regulatory basis, it's better to have some flexibility in the rules. But there were people who thought that, okay, if 75% is the minimum, I'm going to do better than that. This is very American. I'm going to do 100% and then crow about it, right? So you see people doing that, and you still see it today. I do it for our Sangiovese. It's 100% Sangiovese. But there are no rules about that. That's purely a personal choice about how far you want to take it and for what reasons you want to do that. So blends really were struggling in the marketplace, even though Phelps introduced Insignia in 1974. That was the first vintage of Insignia, and that was the first time we had one of these sort of super blends, Bordeaux blends, coming out of California. And it got it got a great reception. But other people then tried to follow suit and ran into the blending thing.
Blending thing?
The blending attitude, the attitude that blending isn't good. This is why you always see proprietary names on these blends.
Why couldn't Insignia get around that attitude?
Because they were pretty established at the time they did it. Okay. Yeah, they already had a good name, and they were really the only ones doing it. So, and he wasn't making a big fuss about it being a blend. It was just a special wine.
Was partly because it was called table wine.
Yeah, that was considered a pejorative too. Yeah, that was our rules. If you can't put a varietal name on it, then you have to call it either red wine or And it used to say table wine. I think they've dropped that now, but it used to have to say red table wine or white table wine. That was a big fuss for Opus 1 too. Yeah, why would you do that? Especially if you're used to French wines. If they say vin de table, it's way down here somewhere. You know, it's not a happy thing to put on a label.
So how come Insignia didn't have to say it, or did they say it?
I think they probably did. It's probably just in the smallest possible type and lost in the design somewhere, you know.
Well, the insignia doesn't have a varietal, it's just insignia.
Yes.
So they didn't violate 75% cab or whatever's in there.
Correct. That's why proprietary names have come to be so. The same thing happened in Italy with the Super Tuscans. I mean, you know, they just said, look, it's more important to me to make a wine that I think is going to be better than to have my appellation on, or my, you know, whatever the normal Chianti Classico, whatever on it. So, and that's, you know, that's a good thing. That's one of the big differences actually between the U.S. wine industry and other areas that have more history, is that we really have a lot of freedom to innovate, because our rules don't constrain us, except to being essentially honest in what we say on the label and not poisoning people. Those are the two sort of underlying ideas. There are a lot of details associated with that too. So anyway, in the back to blending for just a second, in the late, when was that? Late 80s, I guess, maybe 86, 88, the Meritage Association was created to educate the American public about blends, notably Bordeaux blends. It was all about Bordeaux blends, because we didn't want to call them Bordeaux blends, we wanted to call them something else. And the name was the result of a contest where somebody submitted the idea of merit and heritage being combined, because the idea was that blending was not to stretch something, it was to build something better, right? And that was interesting. It got off to a pretty good start, and then after a few years, I mean, people got used to the idea of blends being positive instead of negative. But then after a few years, it just kind of, you know, the Meritage Association kind of, you know, fell apart. Well, okay, fine, but it did its work.
What did people have to pay to use the name?
Oh, it was cheap. It was like, I can't remember now. The annual dues might have been, it was either $100 or $500.
So
That was not a barrier.
The pushback of that was just the principle of that.
Well, you know, at some point, yeah, okay. Who knows why? Most of the people making those blends were really small. You know, the people who had been making proprietary blends for a long time had gotten them very established, like Insignia, and Gallo would never play because they never get involved in anybody else's marketing programs. But if you didn't need the help, you didn't join the Meritage Association and do the work. So, but a lot of people did, and it did, I think, make a difference. But then winemakers decided they wanted to be more creative than just the Bordeaux varieties, and they started throwing Syrah into their Meritage blends, which was against the rules. You know, that was not the concept. So over time, the whole blending thing just kind of went off the deep end into outer space, and that's also why Meritage didn't, you know, continue on its path. But in the process, blending got seriously rehabilitated, and people aren't afraid of it at all anymore, at least here, which is a good thing, I think. Some of those blends are kind of weird, though. Let's see. What was I going to tell you on the other hand? Single, yeah, the varietal thing didn't get going until, well, Louis Martini, actually, right after Prohibition, was one of the first ones to do varietal labeling, and then others picked up on it. Actually, there were three people who kind of really understood the Cabernet thing as being very particularly happy here in Napa, and that was Martin Stelling, which is the property that's now owned by Farniente, and Andrei Chelychev, obviously, who was a young Russian. Well, I think he was 38 when he got here, but maybe he came here in 1938. No, he didn't. Couldn't have. Yeah, he could have. Sorry, don't know when he came here, but he was here for a long time. He retired in 1973 for the first time, so that sort of tells you what his work life was likely to have happened. And Cesare Mondavi, who was the father of Robert and brother, what's his name? Peter, thank you. Anyway, they were the ones who really got into the Cabernet thing here in Napa and were promoting it.
Now, why was Andrei Chelychev so influential?
Because he was really good at what he did. I mean, if you stop to think about, he was a trained enologist, yeah, and he brought, I think he trained in Russia and in France before he came here. And then he just sort of raised the bar. He walked into a winery that had all redwood fermenters, which was not uncommon because bringing oak out here before the railroad was really expensive. And people didn't think of cutting down any of the nice oaks around here to make barrels, and that just didn't happen. So the redwood was plentiful and it did the job. Of course, it didn't do the whole job, but it was a sealable container, let's put it that way. Barriques were not here. He brought barriques in. Yeah, a few, but they were American wood because Madame de Pins, the owner, the daughter of Georges de la Tour, was very tight-fisted, and she wouldn't pay for French oak, but she let him have American oak barrels. I think that if you stop to think about what he could have done had he had a few more resources to work with, it's pretty amazing because he really raised the bar around here. He trained a lot of people and really spread the idea of hygiene in wineries, which was also kind of a new idea. Yeah, and the single vineyard things, and really the importance of tasting the wine. You just don't make it. You get the grapes and you throw it in a fermenter and off it goes, and you try to keep it clean. He was always looking for ways to make the wines better, and that sort of set a path. And that's the same path Robert Mondavi set out on too, because his family, when they bought Krug, they were very much into innovation. I think they bought it in 10 years after Prohibition ended. But they brought a lot of innovation, like Peter brought cold fermentation for white wines. Nobody had done that around here before. They also brought in French barrels, which is probably a result of the trip that Bob took to France, though Krug takes credit for it. But it's probably Bob, because he was pretty notorious for running around Europe, picking people's brains. Yeah, that's right. He was still there. Yeah, exactly. So that they did things like this that really changed the quality of the wines, and that stays today. Everybody feels the same way about that. This is such a special little place that we don't deserve to be here if we're not willing to just keep investing in making things better. And well, I won't talk about Mondavi right now. Anyway, Bob's first visit to Europe was apparently in 1972. And he spent some time in Bordeaux and came back pretty inspired about grape varieties and barrels and all the things that were going on in Bordeaux that really weren't going on here. I mean, there really wasn't any Merlot to speak of around here until the late 80s, 1980s. Just to put this in perspective for you.
Wasn't Duckhorn doing Merlot in the mid-late 80s? Because they had Three Palms. That was.
Yeah, they were, but there's nothing compared to the amount of Merlot that came later. Right. These guys were the first ones.
I remember that at that time, if you wanted Merlot, Duckhorn was the only game in town.
Yeah, they had it all to themselves for a long time. Absolutely, and people weren't using it to blend either, except for a few that had a French influence. And Cab Franc, well, couldn't find that. And Malbec, nope, sorry.
Stood out because they were the big Merlot guys.
Yeah, well, Cabernet too. They also stood out. They started in '72, which was the year we got here, and I always really liked their wines, but they were so different stylistically from the other wines, the other Cabernets being made around here. They were much more subtle and much more European. Can I say that? I mean, so clearly the winemaker can have a lot of influence. We all sort of think vineyards are 80% of it and winemaking is 20. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, certainly you can't make great wine from bad grapes, but a winemaker can have a lot of influence on how the style of the wine. Some more sort of weird things, like this one I love. It wasn't until 1967 that the production of dry red wine overtook the production of sweet wine in Napa. Yeah. How's that for a shocker?
Was it dry sweet wine? I mean, excuse me, was it red sweet wine or white sweet wine?
I think they were all sweet. Yeah, they were also. There was a lot of dessert wine being made, in spite of the taxes on dessert wines. Anything over 14% alcohol, that's changed. Was in a higher tax class, paid more taxes, and yet the perception, and I think the market proved this, was that people wanted to drink sweet wines. So they did. That's White Zinfandel. Yeah. That was a lucky fluke for Sutter Home, wasn't it? But they were paying attention. They said, oh, these people really like this mistake. I'll have to do that one again. Wow. Yeah. And then, once you got past the varietal revolution, then you get into, it's a constant refinement thing. The single vineyard designations on labels. Apparently the Isley Vineyard was the first one to really require that. Milt Isley said, okay, you can have my grapes, but you got to put the name of my vineyard on your labels. Yeah. And so then they had to change the, create a rule that said if you had a vineyard designation, it had to be 100% from that vineyard. Yeah. Okay. And then the Judgment of Paris happened in 1976. That really put us on the map in the minds of Europeans, and also the East Coast. The East Coast was very devoted to European wines, and California was kind of gradually catching up to its and surpassing its reputation for Blanc, which was kind of fed by Gallo a little bit, because they were big and powerful, and they always got to a new market before anybody else did, and kind of established California as Gallo. Let's see, where was I? Judgment of Paris. Then the next thing that happened, and this is kind of interesting because the early pioneers, not that many of them were French. There were a lot of Swiss and Germans, but not that many French, so a few. But then later on, in the 70s, Domaine Chandon happened, and that was a big deal. That was the first big wine house in Europe that spent a lot of money here, much less the U.S., but here in Napa. And that was the shot heard around the world. It was right up there with the 76 thing, and it was before the tasting in 76. It was in 73. 5 years later, here come the rest of the champagne houses. 10 years later, they all followed. And now there's another whole wave in the aughts. People buying, Latour buying Arajo, for example. Chanel, which is not even a wine family, except they do own a couple of wineries in Bordeaux. Yeah. But they bought Saint-Supri. Yay! I was so proud that they bought it, because that's a really good family business. Robert Parker happened. That was another influence, but much more of an influence on winemaking styles, I would say, then. And a lot of people view that as being improved quality. The riper, more extracted, higher alcohol, really big personality kind of wines. That's been going on a long time. It seems to be, the pendulum seems to be heading back in the other direction, which is, for me, a happy piece of news. Just to generalize, to wrap this up, I think of the 70s as sort of the decade of winemakers, when they were just in a whole world of discovery of new wines and trying all kinds of stuff and, making mistakes, but being so excited about it. I mean, I used to have parties where in our little rented cottage down in Carneros, we had a Pinot Noir party. And a ton of winemaker friends showed up, and they all brought a bottle of wine. We had an old bottle of Pinot Noir for Gregory's birthday from the tasting room manager at Beaulieu. So, of course, that was a big hit. That was really good. And then we had another one. We did a Chardonnay party, because Chardonnay was a big hot deal. And again, the same thing happened. People just wanted to get in there and taste as many of them as they could and learn as much as they could. It was just a lot of excitement going on about winemaking. In the 80s, it sort of shifted